Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
I wanted to begin by thanking everybody who had been in touch with very nice feedback about the last episode that we did on the relationship between Attlee and Churchill. It's always interesting for us to see which episodes receive the most attention and get the most listeners, and perhaps it's no great surprise that it's the one that includes the two namesakes of the show. But we've been really pleased that people seem to have enjoyed that episode. And as ever, if you do have suggestions for topics we may talk about, please feel free to comment in the Patreon chat or to drop us an email. For this week's Matters of Interest, I wanted to begin by talking about something that William Hague said in an interview with The Telegraph that was written up in a piece called William Hague, Leading the Tories was the least successful part of my political career. I think Hague is somebody who's always worth listening to, partly because he ticks the box that I often look for in a weighty politician, in that he has seen more than one turn of the political wheel. William Hague entered Parliament in 1989 in a by-election. He remained an MP until 2015. He was there for the 92 victory, the 97 defeat. He led the Conservative Party into its 2001 defeat. He was there as part of the recovery between 2005 and 2010, and then back in government as Foreign Secretary. And now he's in the House of Lords alongside being Chancellor of Oxford. So he has seen that politics operates really as a cycle, and he's seen multiple turns of the political wheel. One of the things that took off online that you said in this article has been written up like this. In recent years, there has been much criticism of the quality of our political class, despite many prime ministers being cultivated at Oxford, where Hague is now Chancellor, and Cambridge. Lord Hague admits, quote, "I'm slightly concerned about the talent pipeline. Politics has become too focused on producing local representatives rather than national leaders. Winston Churchill was not a local MP. Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, David Cameron, they were not elected because they were the local candidate. They were elected because they had real potential. We risk creating a parliament of local caseworkers rather than people capable of leading the country internationally." There's quite a bit to agree with in what Hague says, but I think there's also some things to challenge and also some points to caveat. First of all, if I start with the point that I want to agree with, it is absolutely that we do need to use the House of Commons as a way of identifying and cultivating leaders of genuine potential who can form the cabinet or can be prime minister and can lead on the world stage. Therefore, we simply cannot just make members of parliament super councillors for their local area and expect that that will necessarily follow. I think there is some sense in which parties nationally and in constituencies have to be conscious of the larger potential of the people that they're seeking to select to really serve and deliver in British politics. A slight challenge to that, though, is that in fact the national leaders pipeline that Hague somewhat talks up has been in place for quite a long time in this country, and it hasn't necessarily served us all that well. The principle that you would take somebody like a David Miliband and drop them into South Shields. I don't know how often David Miliband went to South Shields before becoming its MP. I suspect not that many times. And then, therefore, that they would be elevated from the special advisor, from the SPAD class, and propelled to the front bench of the House of Commons. And therefore, that is the talent that we need in our politics secured. Well, I actually think we've had that for quite a long time, and I don't think those politicians have necessarily served us especially well. Secondly, it's not the case that local representatives or people who start out their political career as local representatives cannot subsequently go on to be national leaders too. In fact, there's a part of me that thinks that if you were to have people who have first got involved in politics by knocking on the doors in a regional part of the country, speaking to members of the public, trying to win their support, keeping a small organisation like a constituency party going, and then maybe becoming a councillor, maybe first standing for Parliament in a no-hoper seat, and then eventually becoming an MP. But they would have been on a very different track to somebody who has been a special advisor and has been dropped into a historically safe seat to try and become an MP. There's no reason why that more local representative can't necessarily go on to be a leader of national standing either. And in fact, it's partly for political parties to be able to identify talented people in the regions, not just those who circle around the orbit of Westminster, and propel them forward. A third point I wanted to make is about what it actually means to be local or a local representative. And there's a bit of a distinction that I want to try and draw. It would be harmful if we think of being a local MP as simply being an MP from that area. You sometimes see this in leaflets, etc., where somebody will say, I was born and bred in Teesside, and therefore, almost as if that's a reason alone why they ought to be somebody's MP. That in and of itself is not a good reason to elect somebody. And so I don't think we should fetishize this idea of people being from the local area in order to represent its local interest. But there is a sense in which I actually do think members of Parliament ought to also see themselves as local representatives as well as national legislators. And I actually think we have some examples of people who have done this really quite well. So one of the examples for that would be Theresa May. Of course, who was 6 years Home Secretary, 3 years Prime Minister. Plenty of things that people will criticise about Theresa May. But she was, by all accounts, a conscientious constituency MP. Her home was in her constituency. She spent time there. She cared about what was going on there, not to the detriment of being able to serve on front bench roles, which she did almost for the entirety of her political career. The former MP for the seat that we now live in Witney in Oxfordshire, David Cameron, I actually think was very good at doing that as well. I still hear people mention David Cameron to me in favourable terms locally. Now, of course, he spent the vast majority of his time as local MP, as also leader of the Conservative Party, with literally national and then as Prime Minister, international demands on his time. But he still managed to be partially grounded in the area that he represents and be seen as an effective representative of it, as well as a national leader. To kick off our conversation about that, I basically wanted to say that the idea of cultivating a political class through special advisors or whatever, who then become our national leaders, propelled to the front of the queue to get into the House of Commons, has not proved particularly successful in recent years. I think it would be wrong to say that local representatives, i.e. members of Parliament who emerge from regions, cannot themselves go on to be effective national leaders. And that we ought to expect, in fact, our MPs, irrespective of the track that they take to getting into the House of Commons, to be able to focus on both things at once, to be able to effectively be the voice of their own constituency, but also to be able to focus on national and bigger issues as well. That shouldn't be an either-or arrangement. We should really want MPs who are capable of doing both.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with that. I would say, for me, locality should not be a limiting factor, both for someone who is seeking a parliamentary seat to say that they can only seek a parliamentary seat with which they have a local connection. And also it shouldn't be a limiting factor where it says to a local constituency, you must only select someone who is local. Indeed, you should be selecting someone who you believe will make the best member of parliament. Now, there are, of course, different trade-offs as to what one might want to see in a member of parliament. Some constituency associations might look for a member of parliament who they believe does look like they're going to be a national figure in some way or another, and they're likely to become a front bencher. And they realize that if that's the case, then that may limit their ability to be a more particularized local representative. On the other hand, there may be parts of the country where they feel, well, actually, what we want is more of someone who's likely to be a backbencher, but is someone who is seen as raising the profile of our local area. And often this is a continuum rather than a dichotomy. I think that William Hague, though, is onto something in the sense that I I can remember the last general election, a friend of mine who was quite heavily involved in assisting the Labour Party in selection processes said to me, if you're interested in getting selected for Parliament, think of a part of the country that you have a personal connection for and put in, let me know and we'll see if we can put your name in for selection. And I thought, well, I've lived in 4 towns in Britain, my hometown in Bedford, Cambridge and Oxford, where I went to university. And at that time, I was living in Lancaster, where I moved after university to take up my first job at Lancaster University. And I thought, well, hang on a second, all 4 of them already have Labour MPs. And that was basically the end of that was the end of the search. I mean, it wasn't a sort of particularly rigorous search on my part, but I sort of there is sort of a reflection I might have there, which is, not speaking about myself personally, but why should it be the case that if someone is just, in a sense, unlucky enough to be born in a place where their local party already has an incumbent, they have to wait for that incumbent to die or retire or be replaced before they can seek selection for Parliament? It seems a very peculiar expectation. I think also there is a responsibility of members who select MPs to not be too precious about the local link. You talked about kind of people who seek selection and how they overemphasize their local connections and find all these tenuous links. People in the last election set of selections for Labour constituencies where they would make reference to some great, in some cases, great grandparents who was a miner in the local areas, some kind of sign of connection. I mean, if we start going to parents or grandparents, and that does start to open up more constituencies. My father from Leicester and grandfather from Newcastle, I suppose, but it does seem rather tenuous and inauthentic. And actually, what I really liked was when Caroline Flint, the Labour MP for the Don Valley from 1997 until 2019, first sought her selection, and she shared her letter that she wrote for her selection in the 1990s. And she writes in it something like, I'm not going to pretend that I have any connections to this constituency. I'm not going to make reference to some long dead ancestor as some kind of tie to the local area. I'm paraphrasing. That's basically what she said. But she said, what I will commit to you is that if you do select me and I am elected, I will move here and my family will move here and we will make our lives in this constituency. And she was absolutely true to that. I know that because I've been to her house and I know Caroline and her husband Phil, both wonderful people. And they raised their family in their constituency, the Don Valley, which they had no connection to personally. I think that's a fair enough trade-off, is if you select someone who's not local, within reason, putting an expectation that they try to make something of their lives in the constituency is not necessarily a bad one. That being said, there are many examples of very good MPs throughout history who did not live in their constituencies, had no ties to their constituencies, in some cases didn't even set up a constituency office. I think of, for example, Barbara Castle, one of my great heroes, who herself was from Bradford, who represented Blackburn in Parliament from 1945 until 1979. She had no personal connection to Blackburn. She never owned a house in Blackburn. She'd go up once a month and stay in the same hotel room in Blackburn for, I think, one night, maybe 2, and that would be the extent of her constituency involvement. What I found even funnier was when she was an MEP from 1979 to 1989. She was the first Labour group MEP leader in the elected European Parliament, and MEPs are entitled to have constituency offices. And Barbara Castle, not being really accustomed to this, I think, put her constituency office in London, even though she was the MEP for Greater Manchester, which tells you something about the view. There were other MPs who I much admire from that generation, like Peter Shaw, who thought that constituency offices were a waste of taxpayers' money and refused ever to open up one. And you think of many great MPs, I think, from the Labour perspective, people like Jim Callaghan, who was an MP for Cardiff. He had no connection to Cardiff before he was selected. Or Michael Foot, who, after losing his Plymouth seat, which he did have a connection to, was selected for the by-election in Ebbw Vale, Nye Bevan's former constituency. Michael Foot had no connection to Ebbw Vale. Going back to the point about MPs perhaps making the trade-off of agreeing to live in their constituencies, I think there is something to be said about the way in which being a constituency MP can shape an MP and how that can be quite healthy and good for an MP. You gave the example of Theresa May, who's in some ways sort of the preeminent example, I think, of a very senior frontbench MP, of course, a prime minister, who was still known to do lots of work in her constituency and was able to both be a constituency representative and a national politician. And I think of that older generation of Labour MPs that I valorise so much, and someone like Tony Crosland. Now, Crosland, who was minister in the Wilson and Callaghan governments, rose to be Foreign Secretary before his untimely death in 1977. He didn't actually move to Grimsby, so he didn't quite fit this bill. But one thing I do think is interesting is that Crosland was very much shaped by being MP for Grimsby. He almost fell in love with Grimsby. One of the first things he did as an MP when he was elected, or maybe even when he was selected, was he went out on a long-range fishing trawler with the men of Grimsby out at sea for a week or something like that to get a sense of how they live their lives. You know, people say, oh, well, this isn't much. He did make a point of going up to Grimsby and spending time with his constituents. I think in the podcast episode we did about Crossland, he even forced Henry Kissinger to redirect his plane from London to Lincolnshire to come up and see him in Grimsby, because he was attending constituency events and always went to see Grimsby Town Football Club and brought Henry Kissinger to watch Grimsby Town. That sort of thing, I think, is a great feature of our system. And so some people who take William Hague's view would say, well, the problem here is first past the post and the constituency link, and you want the way that you get more nationally minded, policy-focused MPs is to remove that constituency link and create these great big constituencies that you have under PR. I don't advocate that. I think it is an exchange. And at the moment, I think that the balance is tipped too much into the hyper-local mindset, which sees an MP primarily as effectively a constituency caseworker, rather than someone who's both a constituency caseworker, sure, but is probably first and foremost a national representative for our national parliament.
I think it's worth just distinguishing between localism and its meaning in selection to be an MP, and also how it might apply to somebody's service as an MP. I agree with you. Being hyper-parochial around selection is not in and of itself a good thing. I mean, if it were, for example, there are lots of Tories from Liverpool who go on to have political careers who now wouldn't, because they couldn't get selected beyond their home area. Now, that would obviously be rather daft, and would be a way to unnecessarily and needlessly narrow the political talent that we have in our country. I think the Crossland example that you give is actually a very good one, of somebody who didn't have a connection to it, but then said that they would really care about the place that they represented and threw themselves into it. I think that is really the effective way of doing it. And that doesn't mean that you have to become a super councillor as Member of Parliament. We have quite a few MPs at the moment, I think, persuaded in part by the extraordinary political volatility we're going through, and also in the case of lots of Labour MPs, just quite how small their majorities are and quite how poor Labour's current polling is, who see the way to win re-election as basically to be super councillors for their area, reporting potholes and all the rest of it. I don't actually think that's necessarily what it's about. And again, I would come back to this point about the local focus and the national focus not being mutually exclusive. So an example we've not mentioned yet quite recently would be somebody like Jeremy Hunt, who is apparently a very highly regarded constituency MP in Surrey, but of course was also on the front bench for much of the Conservatives' time in government, including as Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's not unconnected, I don't think, that he was really in the line of fire from the Liberal Democrats to take his constituency at the last election, and instead he clung on and managed to have an extraordinary win in the 2024 general election. And he did that, I think, by being a figure of genuine national significance, but also somebody who was a recognisable face in the constituency as well. Let's beg the question of what should we, as members of the public, expect from our local MP? And I think from the discussion we've had, things which are really not unreasonable are for MPs to have a home in the constituency. Obviously, there was a time when that was very rarely expected, and people's non-London home was often anywhere but their constituency. In plenty of cases, Barbara Castle would be an example of that, so would Roy Jenkins and others. But I do think there is now, particularly given that there is an expenses regime that covers the costs of a second home for most members of Parliament, I do think it is not unreasonable for people to expect that their MP does have a house in the constituency, and then that's where they spend at least some time. Secondly, I think there is a reasonable expectation that people would do regular constituency surgeries and be at least partially present in the constituency. There were some MPs of a slightly older vintage than now, but not quite back to the Castle or Foote or Jenkins days or Crossland days, who would basically very rarely spend any time in their constituency. The former Labour MP for Middlesbrough, Stuart Bell, apparently went off to his flat in Paris at the weekends rather than to his constituency. Similarly, there was a Labour MP in Blackpool who was always rumoured didn't spend his weekends in the seaside resort he represented, but at his home in Brighton instead. Now, these are things where, you may say, well, let them spend their time where they wish to spend their time. But, well, they have signed up to be somewhere as Member of Parliament. It's not to say they can never have a holiday, but I actually think to spend at least some time living as your constituents live is really not out of the question. And like we say, it's something that people like David Cameron and Theresa May managed to pull off. Just a final thought. If we're to try and improve the talent pipeline going into politics, which is the thing that William Hague raised concerns about, the question of how do we fix that is much, much more complicated than whether or not we simply try and prioritise MPs having local connections or doing a local job. There are questions about how do our parties identify and attract people? How do they approve and select people? How attractive does it appear to somebody to be a member of Parliament? Not just in terms of salary, which is an often discussed and quite laboured point, but also in terms of what sort of support do you get? What are the pressures that you're under? What are the things that you are likely to be able to achieve in a political career that may mean a great deal to you? So I think if the pipeline is weak, and I think it's perfectly possible that it is, then addressing it is about much, much more than worrying about how locally focused or otherwise future MPs are going to be.
If I could just add one final point there, some of the responsibility for this requires people who are MPs or who aspire to MPs to resist some of the pressures to become overly parochial, and to see that as part of their job is about broadening out these concerns and being a conduit, in a sense, from the local to the national and the national to the local. There's an MP who I won't name, but I know does listen to this podcast, who I was speaking to last summer during the August recess, and he was saying that he was using the August recess to read, and he wanted to read works of history and law. He was particularly interested in the European Convention on Human Rights and to understand the history of that and the jurisprudence around that, and particularly his party's relationship to that document. And I thought, how wonderful. How wonderful for an MP to realize that part of their job is not just to go out and spend the August recess either on holiday, although, as you say, MPs are entitled to holiday, it's fine, or to see their time in their constituencies just rushing from constituency photo op to constituency photo op to surgery to surgery to surgery, as important as those might be, but to also understand that part of their role is that they are a national legislator and that they need to be as well informed as they can about these much larger issues, both for their own sake, but also because, of course, those issues may impact their constituents. And I wonder, I may be wrong on this, I wonder how many MPs do spend that time away from Parliament, actually just absorbing and learning and researching about the bigger issues as a way of improving themselves as a member of Parliament. I don't know, is there other MPs who do this? Please let me know.
Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, my matter of interest this week has been spurred by an invitation that I received to speak at a debate this week. And the topic of the debate is: this House believes that wealth inequality is a natural and healthy feature of any free and democratic society. And I was asked to oppose this motion. On the one hand, this seemed like a relatively straightforward and simple task. I am a socialist and an egalitarian, and so a motion like this should really, or opposing a motion like this should be my bread and butter. But what was quite useful about this exercise was that it caused me to revisit some of my first principles about my politics. I think over time, if we are people that feel like we're driven by certain core matters of principle or conviction, we just imbibe those and we don't really come back to rethink why we hold those in the first place. That's not to say that we no longer hold those positions, but it's worth revisiting those. And so I thought about equality in two senses, taking the language of the question about equality being natural and equality being healthy, and also about its relationship to a free and democratic society. And so I went back and read when I was a teenager. I suppose maybe I don't know how many politically minded teenagers do this, but when I was a teenager, I read a lot of books about kind of socialism and socialist theory. Many of these books belonged to my grandfather, and my grandmother, who was still alive at the time, encouraged me to read his books. So these are books written by people like Hugh Dalton, who became Clement Attlee's Chancellor, or Aneurin Bevan, or socialist academics like G.D.H. Cole or Harold Lasky or Richard Titmuss. And so I went back and looked at some of those works. And they were very instructive, because I think for critics of equality, the first thing that they jump on is the idea that inequality is natural. In one sense it is, and in one sense, in my view, it isn't. In one sense, of course, it is true that we are all different. We have all different abilities, physicalities, talents. So we are not the same. To say that we are equal is not to say that we are the same. But from a moral perspective, I would argue that all humans are equal because they are humans. And although that sounds like a rather cliche tautology, I think it's actually a really important point, that every person has equal dignity and equal value, no matter who that person is. Now, where that insight and conviction comes from, for someone like me, I think was shaped and inspired by my Christian faith that I had when I was growing up. But it's not to say that it has to come out of Christianity, of course, it can come out from other faith traditions, or merely as an ethical position. But this question is not just about inequality in sense of differences or differences of personality. It talks about wealth inequality. And effectively, this is a discussion about the class system. And here, we're referring to what the socialist academic Richard Titmuss called collectively imposed social and economic inequalities. These are inequalities that, in effect, limit the ability of people to realize their differences. And that may sound somewhat paradoxical to say that inequality is about allowing people to realize their differences. But what we are saying when we say that we oppose social inequality is we are saying that we are removing the barriers that the social and economic system have placed on people to prevent them from living a life that results in the enjoyment of those talents and differences. And many of the socialist theorists and writers that I looked at that time would often tie together equality and liberty as intrinsically linked. If you have a system where people can only enjoy, let's say, a life in which they can pursue a career that's meaningful for them, even raise a family today, if they have the benefits of intergenerational inherited wealth then that is a society that has restricted freedom from some people. And other people are able to enjoy those freedoms and others aren't for purely arbitrary reasons. The socialist egalitarianism that I subscribe to goes further, I think, than, say, liberal theories about this, which say, well, what you have to have is a system of equality of opportunity. Then you sort of let people run off and they accrue whatever they can accrue, and those who don't accrue, don't accrue. But quite frankly, I think that kind of system is incompatible with a system of equality of opportunity if you think about then what it means for the next generation. So what you have to do is you have to try to achieve a system where, of course, people can have certain benefits that accrue to them for various inputs that they put into the system. We're not talking about some kind of, as Anthony Crosland called it, a drab extreme where people would have no benefits of their efforts and intellects and talents. But what we're talking about is a system where that system of reward does not become so excessive that it ends up denying to others the opportunities to achieve what they ought to be able to achieve on the basis of their talents and merits. And so that requires a trade-off. It means that you can't just extract perhaps the full remuneration or benefits. You have to think about what you contribute to others to enable them to achieve something of their talents and merits as well.
It's an interesting thought, and I look forward to hearing how the debate goes. Some things I wanted to offer on it. I don't necessarily mind, and I rather think that a lot of people don't mind, reward being excessive for extraordinary achievements. But what I think most people would say, and what certainly I believe, is that the important thing about reducing inequality is you want to knock the harsher edges off what happens if you have a generally free market economy, which is that there are people who can easily fall into poverty or destitution, either because of poor decision making of their own or things that they cannot help, such as being disabled or being at the wrong end of an economic cycle or whatever the case may be. And the only fair way that we've really concluded to do that is to redistribute from the people who have the most that they can give away in the direction of the people who have the least. And that what you can achieve with that is to basically try and end destitution and extreme poverty. I think that is something which almost everybody does get on board with, minus the most extreme libertarians. I think there are some problems that we've had in this country, even with that relatively modest approach to reducing inequality. One of them is that, generally speaking, in the UK, we struggle to have a sense of wealth and income, how they relate to questions of inequality, and also how they relate to the tax system. So, for example, the best investment that many people of the last generation or two have ever made is the one that's in their main property. That will have given them a much better return than any other investment that they've ever made. Yet that is the one that we typically exempt from tax that would apply to other investments. And therefore, that is an accrual of wealth, which has been enjoyed by a couple of generations, but will not necessarily be enjoyed by others, which is basically outside of the tax system. That's not necessarily something I think we should change, but it is one of the challenges we've had. We do find it much easier in this country to tax income. And one of the problems, I think, for those who would like to see a much more redistributive role for the state to reduce inequality is when it comes to income and income tax. That is already largely what we have. I mean, it's hard to see how it could be all that much more redistributive than what it currently is. About 1% of income taxpayers in the UK pay 30% of all income tax that is received by the Exchequer. And if you extend that to the top 10%, then they pay 60% of all income tax. So that does look to me like what we already have is a active state that is being highly redistributive in terms of how it funds itself, and with the benefits of that funding primarily being people who are less well off. The challenge I think that poses is that in spite of what appears to be a highly redistributive income tax system, it hasn't worked in terms of changing people's minds about whether or not we are an equal or unequal or fair or unfair country in terms of economic distribution. So right now, of course, one of the fads of politics in early 2026 is that we have a Green Party led by Zach Polanski, who is making a lot of political hay out of attacking billionaires, of which there are very, very few, really, and making big arguments about economic equality and inequality. And part of the reason why those arguments have salience is that what we have done so far as a country to try and reduce inequality has, in one sense, been highly ambitious in terms of those figures that I gave about who pays what tax. But at the other stage, appears to most people to have been deeply ineffective. So if we are to try and reduce inequality further, the question really becomes how? Because those conventional levers that the state will pull, or the dials or the tax rates that people in number 10 and number 11 will tweak, seem to have been pulled and tweaked as far as they reasonably can without the entire system falling apart. And therefore, you would really need to be a lot more creative about our thinking if we were to look at other ways to reduce inequality than what we currently have.
I don't dissent from that point that in our society today, in Britain today, one of the biggest contributors to inequality is is housing, and the inequalities that the housing sector has entrenched. Housing, of course, is main form of intergenerational wealth transfer in this country and in most developed economies. And so people feel very protective about housing ownership and the ability to pass the wealth of their house to their children. And in one sense, that's an understandable conviction that people have. On the other hand, it creates so many perversions in our society. It creates a system where people who have parents who own their own home are, in some cases, effectively waiting for their parents to die in order to achieve the kind of life that they want to achieve, which is a very nasty and unfortunate situation for people to be in. There are, of course, many people who don't have parents who own their own home, and they will therefore never accrue those benefits. And so people who work equally hard and have equal talents may see profoundly different life experiences simply because of the wealth of their parents. And that is exactly the kind of perversity, exactly the kind of limit on freedom that makes me a socialist, that makes me someone committed to the goal of equality, because I don't think that that is right or justifiable or efficient or productive for our society.
Just a final thought from me. I think housing is a good theme on which to open up the idea of, do we try and redistribute the wealth and the income that we have as a country in order to reduce inequality? Or do we try and create more of it? And of course, people who are on the right and people who are slightly more free market in their inclination will say, well, we should try and create more of it. And I think the housing point actually rather makes that argument in the sense that we can try and make life more miserable for people who are already homeowners or who have found that the homes that they bought in the early 1980s have appreciated enormously in value. But actually, I don't really see how we're going to do that. Politically, it would be toxic, and I don't necessarily think it would be fair on those people either. The thing to do, I think, is to be much more creative about saying, well, how do we actually invest in new housing stock? Also, again, a contentious issue, but so that for the current generation who struggle to get on the property market, they can have relatively affordable, relatively secure ways of gaining equity in housing that they're currently locked out from. And I think that is ultimately where I fall on this balance, that there are ways to pursue inequality that are basically about attacking somebody else. but actually it's like creating the wealth for the people who don't currently have it, which really ought to be our overriding goal.
Yes, because the goal, as I see it, is not to eliminate difference, but is to make difference largely irrelevant in the ability of people to live their full and complete lives. And so one might say that an alternative to having a very heavy inheritance tax, which would be one way of achieving that, would be to find other ways of providing either capital or housing security to a wider group of people. And that could be another form of doing that. But ultimately, the goal in both instances is to make it so that the mere accident of birth does not give one person the ability to live the full flourishing of their life that another person would be denied purely by the accident of their birth in our society.
That's all for this midweek Matters of Interest. We'll be back on Sunday with our next deep dive into a topic in post-war British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.